Futurism.com reporting about a doctor who used a computer screen, a robotic computer screen, in a hospital to communicate to a man and his family that he was terminal and that he was going to pass away. Now, they reported that a California family is outraged that this doctor told their elderly relative that his lungs were failing and that he was going to die imminently via a telepresence robot. "You might not make it home," the doctor reportedly said, and we have audio featuring how this all went down with some of the comments by the enraged family members. They said this was incredibly impersonal, not the kind of thing you communicate over a computer screen. We have that audio.
Now with new questions about telemedicine. You may have heard of it or have experience with it, doctors speaking and treating patients remotely. But what happens when doctors have bad news to share? Is bedside manner lost in the streaming? One family saying what happened to them is why doctors should be physically present in some cases. Here's ABC's Whit Johnson.
Tonight, Ernest Quintana's family says they're scarred forever after receiving devastating news this week.
There's not a lot of lung for us to work with.
Okay.
The heart's struggling.
Ernest's family knew he was dying of chronic lung disease, but they say they were surprised to get the following grim news by way of a video call with a live doctor.
You know, I don't know if he's going to get home.
This was it. We were going to lose him, and we just got the news.
Annalicia Wilharm was with her grandfather at Kaiser Permanente Medical Center in Fremont, California, and quickly brought to tears.
I can transition you to make sure you're comfortable. Everything is focused around your comfort.
It was pretty sad, very devastating, very disappointing how the news was delivered.
Of course, this appears to just be a one-off. This isn't a new policy, and we don't hear stories all the time about this kind of thing happening. I would imagine it probably isn't the only time. This is the one that's making news. I know these aren't robots per se. This is technology being used in, again, what one might call a cold and impersonal way. And if we're talking about our loved ones in the hospital who may be terminally ill, is it, again, appropriate to communicate that via a live stream where a doctor is in a remote location on a video call with the patient when they are being told, you may not make it home? I certainly think that this raises some ethical questions. And before we get into the question about, whether or not a robot is going to be capable of delivering the same level of comfort to a patient in a care situation like this that a human being will, I think we have to start by asking, at what point do human caregivers begin to act so much like robots and seemingly stray further and further from the role that the name caregiver would seem to imply? I think there are a lot of questions that come to mind with something like this. But again, fundamentally, what we are seeing is the way that machine technologies and, again, robotization of certain aspects of our daily lives is changing with new technology. And there may be no better example of such a technology coming in the next few years, although we're already seeing prototypes and in some cases actual field tests with this technology. That's right, robot cars. We haven't had a robot car update in a while. And this time, The Guardian weighing in, they say automated vehicles offer the promise of fewer road fatalities, cheaper rides, and greater mobility for the blind and otherwise disabled. They could also cost millions of jobs, threaten public transport spending, and upend insurance. And I think here again, just like with the case of the doctor using a computerized system that allows him to be able to go into a room via a live stream without actually having to walk to the other side of the building, sure, this makes for ease of communication and allows a person to get a lot more done without having to move around. And again, there's the time, there's the opportunity cost, all these things, all these considerations. Inevitably, there is going to be good with the bad. But again, what do we lose as people when we rely more on this technology? In the case of the caregivers, the family in that audio soundbite we heard felt like that use of technology was in no way an improvement. That didn't make the experience they had in that hospital better. And shifting again back over to the idea of self-driving cars, although their institution in society might solve a lot of problems, will it also cause problems? And the Guardian piece focuses on a woman named Lisa Walima, and she is one of the first to sign up for essentially what's going to be called the Waymo Early Rider Program. They say until now they haven't even been allowed to speak to the press about this. And apparently Walima said, "I always am more confident in a Waymo than I am in an Uber." She said that this is because I know it's going to be consistent. I do think it's safer. She said last time she took an Uber to the airport, the driver was texting on the freeway as they drove in rush hour. It was terrifying. Now, that's an issue. Again, a lot of this comes down to operator error, and if you have ever ridden with someone in an Uber, again, texting while driving is illegal, but the person who is driving the Uber, and often this is the same case with, if you're riding in a taxi or anything else, often those people have to use apps on their smartphone in order to be able to operate that business. And so to an extent, there are procedures and they have to be able to keep their eyes on the road, but nonetheless, they're also going to have to use that phone. Otherwise, you wouldn't actually be able to call that driver and they wouldn't be able to find you. The smartphone is an integral part of all of this. And therein, perhaps one could also make the case that there is going to be the inevitable concern that arises from the kinds of distractions that humans are prone to. Now, a lot of people have, and we've talked about this in the past, but a lot of people say when it comes to a self-driving car, I don't necessarily feel any safer when I'm in a vehicle where there's no one behind the wheel and the computer is making all the decisions. But statistically, you actually would be safer. And while you are entrusting your life to this computer that is driving this vehicle, you certainly don't have the concern of worrying about the distraction level of your driver and those kinds of dangers that occur when people are involved. And so those who are the advocates of the driverless cars continue to say that, look, this is going to be a safer mode of transportation. And that's one of the fundamental points that Lisa Walima has had talking about this experience. But the Guardian piece also goes on to say that polls show that 52% of people say they wouldn't use a robot car. And they say after an initial rush of hype, the onset of the age of the robot car seems to have been stalled. People were all about it at first. Now more than half say that they wouldn't actually ride in a vehicle where a human wasn't behind the wheel. They just don't trust the robots. And they say, and yet billions of dollars are still being poured into autonomous vehicles. The robot revolution may be slower to arrive than first expected, but again, companies like Waymo, who are trying to institute this kind of thing, definitely think it is coming. And I agree. I think, in truth, it's inevitable. But here's another question. If you don't trust your vehicle to make decisions for you, how would you feel about intelligent computers spotting shoplifters? Or more importantly, how would you feel about a computer spotting a shoplifter before they actually steal anything? Similar to the idea of self-driving cars being capable of managing the road in busy traffic better than a human can do. Now there is a push for technology that would be able to utilize algorithms to spot behavior in people in shopping areas and detect who would be more likely to steal before they've actually stolen something. How do you feel about that? I mean, again, it sounds an awful lot like Minority Report, but VOC, a Japanese startup according to Bloomberg here, has developed artificial intelligence software, they say, that hunts for potential shoplifters using footage from security cameras for fidgeting, restlessness, and other potentially suspicious body language. They say while AI is usually envisioned as a smart personal assistant or self-driving car, again, it turns out the technology is pretty good at spotting nefarious behavior too. And they even make the direct comparison to Minority Report, although you can imagine that's got to happen in a case like this. They say that these algorithms analyze security camera footage and alert staff about potential thieves via a smartphone app. The goal, they say, though, is prevention. If the target is approached and asked if they need help, there's a good chance that that theft actually never happens. So in a lot of ways, this might actually be perceived as being a deterrent more than it is something that is prejudging a person. Again, unlike in Minority Report, people aren't being arrested before they commit crimes. This is AI being used to detect people who might be potential thieves. Now, VOC apparently made headlines last year when it helped to nab a shoplifter, so they've already field tested this again. They said this occurred at a convenience store in Yokohama. VOC had set up its software in the shop as a test case, which picked up on previously undetected shoplifting activity. The perpetrator, however, in this instance was arrested a few days later. Then again, that person had actually also been a shoplifter. But listen to this quote, all right, from Ryo Tanaka, who was the founder of VOC. He said, "We took an important step closer to a society where crime can be prevented with AI." Now, I think at this stage in the game, it is more than fair to ask, are we really? Are we really to a point where we can prevent crime with AI-based shoplifting detection? According to the VOC company, they say that not only that is the case, but they further say that this is something that has been available for a long time and it needs to be implemented. It would actually be a help to society. It might be, in some considerations, less threatening than the idea of robot cars, sure. But that fundamental question in this broader conversation remains, do we trust the computers enough to make those kinds of decisions? Bloomberg reporting, they say the ability to detect and analyze unusual human behavior also has other applications. VOC is developing a video-based self-checkout system and wants to use the videos to collect information on how consumers interact with items in the store to help shops display products more effectively. They say even beyond retail, Takana, who's the CEO of the company, envisions using the video software in public spaces and train platforms to detect suspicious behavior or suicide jumpers. Now, because they say that it involves security, retailers have asked AI software suppliers like VOC and also a London-based company called Third Eye not to disclose their use of anti-shoplifting systems if they're using them. They say it's safe to assume, however, that several big-name store chains in Japan have deployed the technology in some form or another already. And about that company called Third Eye, there's a quote at the end of this article, and they say that at Third Eye Mercatz, that would be, I guess, the CEO of the company, says she's been approached by security management companies looking to leverage their AI technology. The potential is broad since it can be applied outside of shoplifting prevention and outside of retail. But, on an episode of Middle Theory recently, I did a show where we were looking at some of the technologies, facial recognition technologies and the like, being innovated by Amazon, and they're already trying to encourage law enforcement agencies to use these kinds of things. Now, when we're talking about video systems that use AI to detect shoplifting before it happens, the fact that videos are involved, to me, immediately raises a privacy concern. And add to that this is not expected to only be something that we see for use in retail situations. They're saying in the article, again, security companies are contacting us. We're talking about putting these things in public places to be able to watch for suspicious activity. Sure, you would probably be able to detect a lot of those kinds of things. But how do we feel about a society where we're walking around and everywhere we go there are video cameras filming us? And in truth, that's an awful lot like how society already is, right? But add to it that layer of artificial intelligence processing information based on human behavior everywhere that you go. I mean, we aren't to that point yet. But yet again, it seems to me like the inevitability of technology like this, whether it's driverless cars, impersonal interactions between humans via video teleconferencing, or AI being used to scan entire crowds of people, Amazon-style facial recognition technology. I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist here. What I am saying is that if it seems that the implementation of technologies like these are inevitable, and the polls that we look at with regard to, for instance, self-driving cars show that more than half of people don't fully trust the idea of allowing the robot to be in total control. I mean, how do we feel about our entire society essentially being monitored by AI? Is that necessarily a comforting thing? It's designed to keep us safe, but I think that there is the privacy aspect of this, and then, of course, there's the remaining question of trust. Can we trust these robots to make these kinds of decisions on our behalf? Now, think about this headline, also from Futurism. U.S. military, our lethality automated system definitely isn't a killer robot. They report in February the U.S. Army asked experts for ideas on how to build a system that would allow tanks and other ground combat vehicles to quickly and automatically acquire, identify, and engage targets. Some saw this as a step toward autonomous killer robots, leading the Army to now tweak its request. Yes, it now says it wants bots to be able to identify and kill targets, but that doesn't mean we're putting the machine in a position to kill anybody. They're just watching our every move. They're just driving the cars that we ride around in. I think you quickly get to that point in a conversation like this where that old adage comes to mind, be careful what you wish for. And in fact, that reminds me of another article that Adam Olson sent me from the New York Times, and it was essentially asking, is ethical AI even possible? Now, in the past, I've talked with some experts about this, and one fellow who a lot of you guys, if you've listened to the Joe Rogan podcast in recent months, that you may have been made aware of recently is Dr. Benjamin Gertzel. He made his first appearance on Joe Rogan a while back, and I've actually had him on this show a couple of times in the past. And these are among some of the questions I've asked Dr. Gertzel, specifically, not only whether AI could be dangerous to humans, but the fact that that danger may not be intended by the AI. Again, the question of ethics seems to be something related to humans. And sure, we might be able to program a computer to think an awful lot like the way humans think, but will we be able to account for all of the nuances of ethics? This is, again, with the driverless cars, a question that always comes to mind. The driverless car is headed down the highway. and it is in full control of the vehicle, and then an unforeseen circumstance appears where a young girl runs out in the road in front of the car. Now, how might a human react to something like that? If the autonomous vehicle faces a circumstance like this, again, we have to ask the question, how does a human driver react to a situation versus the way that the computer would handle it? It's faced with having to make a snap decision, which could include mowing over an innocent pedestrian. It could include having to swerve over into oncoming traffic. These are questions I think that we have to ask, and it may not be one of those situations where we like what the human would do any better than what the computer would in that case. The question nonetheless remains, how do they differ? And can we trust that the computer will make decisions that we would call, according to human beliefs and values, ethical? So I think that it's very important to ask that question. Could there be ways computers may make decisions and carry out functions that may have an adverse effect on humans, whether or not intended? I talked with Dr. Goertzel about this and also added to it the implication of, well, could this kind of thing, the doomsday scenario, AI means well but does harm, could that actually lead to the end of humanity as we know it? Here's what Dr. Goertzel had to say.
How likely is an involuntary end to the human race? That's something that we really have no way to scientifically project. We're entering into a domain that we've just never seen before. An analogy I like to make is, imagine a bunch of cavemen sitting around in their cave, and one of them has invented something new. It's called language. This caveman has learned to communicate by making sounds out of his mouth in a structured way to communicate with the other cavemen. Now, at that point, when these cavemen have just invented language, how could they project the development of Shakespeare, Britney Spears, differential calculus, World War II, all these things enabled by the development of language? Of course, at the very beginning of language, these cavemen could never envision everything that it was going to lead to. And if you asked one of them, well, what are the odds? What's the probability that this new invention of yours called language is going to cause us all to die someday? How could those cavemen make any reasonable prediction? They could make something up. I think that's sort of the situation that we're in. We're doing something fundamentally new. We are in an unprecedented period of history, and to try to use probability theory to estimate the odds of what's going to happen, it's almost silly. It's an interesting intellectual exercise, but you really can't place much stock in it. Mm-hmm. And this is really where I differ from some of the folks involved with the Singularity Institute for AI. Although I do respect their thinking, and I admire the way they're drawing the public's attention to the singularity in AI and this whole nexus of issues. Some of the Singularity Institute people really hold the opinion that if we make an AGI, an artificial general intelligence, and we can't somehow prove or demonstrate that it's going to be nice to people, then it's almost certain it's going to kill us all. I really don't think that's credible. If they said building an AGI is a risk because once we've built a creature vastly more intelligent than humans, we have no damn idea what's going to happen, then I wouldn't argue with them. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. But being so certain that doom and destruction will follow the creation of an AGI without a provable friendliness architecture, that just doesn't make any sense to me. It makes less sense to me personally than Kurzweil's view, which is probably everything's going to come out okay. But on the whole, I think both of those camps underestimate the radical uncertainty facing the human race once we've created creatures vastly more intelligent than we are. We'll be in the rough position of those cavemen trying to predict the long-term consequences of the invention of language, or say a dog trying to predict the outcome of the war in Iraq.
That final statement, by the way, he says, I think that we vastly underestimate. He actually says both camps, those who are pro and those who are against the idea of AI being utilized in such systems. That conversation, by the way, that I had with Ben Goertzel was from way back in 2012. and I look at how much change has occurred since we had that conversation, again, we're seeing these things very steadily being implemented into our lives, which is part of the reason that Joe Rogan reached out to Ben and says, we're going to have him on from time to time for updates because, wow, I think a lot of us are starting to look at this AI thing and we're kind of realizing it's happening, slowly but steadily. These things do tend to happen very slowly. But like Goertzel says, we vastly underestimate the capabilities of a kind of intelligence. And the AI we're talking about happening right now is not that. We're just talking about smart computers that perform human-like functions that basically make living life a little easier for humans because it kind of outsources all the stuff that we have to focus on and do. But as we do more of that, as we entrust computers to carry out more and more functions, sure, it frees our hands, you might say, but are we necessarily safer and better off as a society in light of all these things? And I do not mean to sound like an alarmist, whether it's talking about computerized systems in hospitals and automated driverless vehicles, if we're talking about AI being used by the military. I'm not trying to be an alarmist at all, but having spoken with experts like Benjamin Goertzel, who I think really is more in the optimist camp, he seems to be someone who is a lot more of the mind that, hey, this will be a good thing in the long run if we manage it properly. And nonetheless, that quote, and I always get chills when I hear him say that we vastly underestimate the potentials of a technology and intelligence that we may create which will far exceed the capabilities of human intelligence. And when we're talking about AI and the singularity and all these kinds of concepts, at the end of the day, I think that is what we have to always remain acutely aware of. We're talking about something that in the eventual sense will be smarter than us. What will that mean for humans? More when we return. It is the Gralien Report. I'm Micah Hanks, and we'll be right back. It's fun to hear from you guys out there in relation to sea serpents. That's just a fun subject, but again, I've found some unique periodical resources on this subject. That is, in the truest sense, Fortiana, and I think that Fortiana in the 21st century always needs to be critically minded and skeptical in approach. Don't just look at old articles and take them at face value. Put those old reports, if you will, through the lens of modernity and see if we can shed new light with current scientific understanding on old ideas. I think that's really important, and so we'll get to a little of that a bit later. But first, I do want to touch on a few emails I got from you guys out there. Now, out there on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, this is a fairly consistent phenomenon that occurs. And the Seneca guns is actually a reference to Lake Seneca in New York, where that was the name that was given for these mysterious booms that occurred. And keep in mind, there is a lot of literature that shows that even prior to the industrialization of the North American continent, there were legends and stories about booms. Many times these were likened to cannon fire or something along those lines off in the distance. And so that name sometimes, Seneca guns, is borrowed in different regions well away from New York, but nonetheless where similar things are reported. And out on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, there are what are called the booming sands. And it is believed that actually there is a geological phenomena in relation to where these sandbars appear out there on the Outer Banks that is conducive to the creation of anomalous noises and sometimes booming or singing. Some people say that from time to time there's almost a musical quality to it, but often the booming sands on the eastern side of North Carolina.